Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot Pei Zayin, a very interesting daf. We're going to finish the 9th chapter, move on to the 10th chapter at the end of daf. So stay tuned toward the end. We're going to get to a really, really famous and important sugya and a chapter that's a very basic chapter of, in general, in Shas and particularly in Yevamot. Anyone who learns Yevamot, really, I think they're learning it for this section. This week's learning is sponsored by Shira Daniel in loving memory of her father, Shlomo Yosef ben Chaim Shmuel, on his Yurtzeit. Today's daf is also sponsored by the Hadron Zoom family in honor of Shira Futornik. Shira, all your self-assumed aunts and a few uncles are inspired by your daily commitment to learning the daf and are a bit verklempt watching you sit daily with your dad to do so. You're realizing a dream that so many of us waited to achieve. In Masechet Brachot, Rabbanit Mishal taught us the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azalya at a young age, already knew as much as a 70-year-old. Hareani kiven 70 shana. But he was always open to learning more. Our wish is that you enjoy the learning you achieve in your youth and always continue to find a fresh perspective in your learning. Happy belated 18th birthday from your Hadron Zoom family. Agreed to all of that. Okay, we're going to get started now. We saw yesterday the Mishnah. Luckily, we got ahead because it's a long daf. I'm not going to review the whole thing, but we basically saw this case of a woman who married successively a Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, and had children with each of them, and then slowly they each died, right? Each husband died, and that's how she married the next one, but she still had kids. So that basically put her in the category, right, of whether to eat whichever one she was recently married to, and whichever one kind of was the most limiting. Like if it was the Yisrael, and she still had a kid from the Yisrael, she couldn't eat maser or truma. Once that kid died, she could go back to eating maser. Once that kid died, she could go back to eating truma. Okay, and similarly for the bat kohen, right, what allows her to go back to her father's house, right, as long as there's only no kids. Otherwise, she can't go back to her father's house, and we saw what she could eat as well. So now, the assumption of that case that we saw, going back to the first case, Meit Benami Levi, I'm starting from the words of the Gemara, on about 10 lines down on Pei Zayin, if her son dies from a Levi, tochal b'truma, right, the hadar achla mishum benami nalan, this concept. Now, we kind of took it as an obvious, but really it's not so obvious. We said that if she married a Kohen, she could eat truma. Then she married a Levi, right? Then he died, but she still had a kid. She continued eating truma. Then she goes to marry the Levi. She loses her rights to eat truma, okay? And then he dies, leaves a son, whatever, okay? We continue the story. When they all die and their kids die, and all that's left is a son from the Kohen, she can go back to eating truma. Where on earth do we get that from? The only case where we see someone can go back to eating truma somewhere is a bat Kohen, where if she's married and then she has no kids, she can go back and eat in her father's house. But that's not the same as this case, right? And in fact, this case, she has children, right? It's the same principle. But where do we get it from? They say it's not such an obvious thing like you might have thought. So, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Rav, bat ubat. We learn it from the bat Kohen case. And if you remember, the pasuk said, we've seen this case a number of times, ubat Kohen, and a bat Kohen, Ki tia almana grushav, she becomes a widow or divorced. V'zera enla, and she has no children. V'shava al beit avia kinureha. I'm going to read the whole pasuk because we're going to darshan it again today. She goes back to her father's house as she was in her youth. Remember that means not pregnant, right? When her youth means not pregnant. Milechem avia tochal, she can eat from the bread of her father. We're going to learn some things from this part also. Okay, and then v'chozar lo yochal bo, we don't need to say that. But the point is that since it says ubat, it includes not only a bat kohen can go back to an earlier situation where she was allowed to eat truma. Even this woman who is a bat Yisrael, who marries a kohen and has children with the kohen, even if later she has some other relationships, if everything's done with those relationships, she has no more husbands, no more children, she can go back to eating the truma. So that's learned out from the word ubat. So again, every time we try to darshan this ubat, and by the way, you might say, we've already darshan this ubat, how can we keep darshaning more things? It's a really good question. I don't have an answer to it. Normally you can learn one thing. This clearly we've darshaned a bunch of times. Kiman ki Rabbi Akiva de darish vavim. What are you saying? This is only like Rabbi Akiva who darshans the vavs, right? Because not everybody thinks every vav in the Torah can be darshaned, right? It's just there. It's not so important. Afilu tema rabbanan, even if you hold by the rabbis, kula ubat krayaterehu. The whole word ubat is extra. Okay, so that's how we learn it. I see you're asking about the Bat Yisrael eating truma because she has a son still from the Kohen. Again, this is after she had a son from the Levi and after she had a son from the Yisrael. If they all die out and we're left with just, the only thing left for her is no more husbands, just a son from a Kohen, that allows her to eat in the Kohen's house. That's the whole chiddush here. she can revert back to a time when she ate truma, even though in the interim she didn't. Okay, and that's the big chidush, and that we learned from the bat kohen case. Now, Tana Rabbanan, we're going to bring another bright about the bat kohen. Now we're switching. Okay, spotlight was on this bat Yisrael who married a kohen, then a Levi, then a Yisrael, and then they all died, etc. Now we're back to the basic law of a bat kohen going back to her father's house. Kishi chozeret letruma ve'ena chozeret lechazev shok. Remember we had this distinction a few dapim ago on daf pei, I think it was pei aleph, but definitely on also pei bet. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about the androgynous. Remember the male androgynous, we treat the androgynous as a male, and the androgynous permits a woman to eat truma, okay, if the androgynous is a kohen, then that androgynous permits the woman to eat truma. Now, we said there was a machloket, does the androgynous allow the woman to eat chazev shok, the thigh and the breast from the sacrifices? That's another gift that goes to the kohanim. We had a machloket, yes or no, based on truma d'oraita d'rabbanan, if you remember that whole machloket. Again, here we start distinguishing. When a bat kohen goes back to her father's house, she cannot eat the chazev shok. She only gets to eat the truma. We're going to see 5 different sources for this, where this is learned from. So, Amar Ravina, Rav Chisda, Amar Ravina Bar Shila, Maikra, what's the pasuk? What's the proof text? Well, another verse about the bat kohen, the pasuk right before where we just read. Ubat kohen, we're in Vayikra Kaf Bet, pasuk Yud Bet. Ubat kohen ki tieh leish zal. Once she marries somebody else, he betrumat hakodeshim lo tochal. She can no longer eat from the trumat hakodeshim. Now, the simple reading would be, well, it's truma. On the other hand, it's kodshim. Kodshim is sacrifices. So what does this mean? So they darshan it to mean bimuram min hakodeshim lo tochal. Things that are taken from sanctified items, sacrificial items, which is the chazev shok, which is taken out of the sacrifice. That she can't eat. And this verse means forever. Okay, even though the next verse says, well, she can go back to her father's house and eat, it's only referring to truma, not to, this is telling you forever she can't eat chazev shok once she gets married. So now that was source number 1. We're going to have a different source though. We're going to see 5. It's a disagreement about where we actually learned it from. Rav Nachman Amar Rabbi Ravua milechem. Notice the word says, I told you before to pay attention, when she goes back to her father's house, it says milechem avia yitochal. From the bread of her father. Whenever the Torah says from, it means not all of it. From the bread of her father she can eat, but she can't eat all the bread of her father. Bread in this context is meant to be understood, according to this drashot, we'll see in a different drashot opposite, is meant to be understood as food in general, not bread, but from the food of her father she can eat. Now, milechem means from the food of her father she can eat, which means she can't eat all the food of her father. She can only eat some of the food of her father. So what's excluded? Prat lechazev shok. Let's exclude the thigh and the breast. Matkif larami barcham. But before we get to options 3, 4, and 5, drashot, we're going to now have a question on this one. He says, wait, why are you saying, I agree that milechem is limiting, but maybe it's limiting, it's saying she can eat from the bread, but there's something else that doesn't happen, that she doesn't revert back to that used to be. Why don't you say, Ema, which means say, Prat la farat nidarim. Maybe it means that once she gets married and goes back, and then divorced or widowed, goes back to her father's house, he can no longer nullify her vows. Remember, he can cancel her vows. When she's married, her husband can cancel the vows. So you might think if she's going back to her father's domain, he can nullify vows. The fact is he can't anymore. Once she's married to somebody, she doesn't go back to him being allowed to undo her vows. So, if that's the case, maybe that's what this verse is teaching us, that halacha. Milechem avia tochal, she can eat from the bread of her father, but he doesn't have full rights to everything about her, meaning he can't undo her vows. So Rava says, that's not a question. Amar Rava kfar paskat tana de Rabbi Yishmael. They already taught it in the house of Rabbi Yishmael. It's not learned from this pasuk, it's learned from somewhere else. The Tana de Rabbi Yishmael, it's actually learned out from the section that talks about the vows of a woman. It says, V'neder amana u'grusha, and it's actually skipped a few words, asher asra nafsha. Okay, if she takes a vow to forbid herself to do something, yakum aleha. It's on her, which means no one else can nullify them. Now the Gemara says, Ma tamud lomar. What is this teaching you? Follow. who would be able to nullify her vows? Halo mutzah michlal av, umutzah michlal baal. She's not under the father's domain, and she's not under the husband's domain, so who on earth would anyway be nullifying her vows? Why would you need a verse to tell you this? To which they say, Ela, okay, imagine the scene. Hare, okay, she's betrothed to someone already. And remember, when someone's betrothed, they live in their father's house still. So now we have this woman, she's about to be married, she's on her way. Okay, two ways she could be on her way. Either masar ha'av l'shluchei ha'bal, her father passed her on to messengers of her husband, and they're taking her to the husband to get married. O shemasru shluchei ha'av l'shluchei ha'bal, or the messengers of the, or maybe the father didn't send her himself, he sent messengers, it really doesn't matter. Sent his own messengers, because shlucho shel adam kimoto, it's as if he did it himself. But anyway, he sends messengers to the husband's messengers, meaning she has a group of messengers escorting her to another group of messengers. So she's basically in between the father and the husband. And what happens? You know already because of the verse. Nit armelo nit garsha baderech. While she's on the way, the husband dies or decides to divorce her. Remember, you need a divorce from erusin, from engagement, betrothal. So in the middle, now this woman, if she was already married, she'd already been taken away from her father, and obviously the father can't nullify the vows. This woman is right in between. She's in between her father. She hasn't fully left her father because either her father's taking her, right? He passes her on. But this is a good question, right? When you pass something, it's like also responsibility. If I'm returning something to you and I give it to a messenger who gives it to a messenger, at what point am I no longer responsible for it? Okay, so here we have, right, this in between. She's right in no man's land, you could call it. So what do we say? What do I call her? Beit avia shel zo or beit bala shel zo, right? We assume she has to be kind of somebody's responsibility. Ela lomar lecha, what they want to say here is no. Kevan shiatza, why does it say neder almana grusha yakum aleha? They're her responsibility, nobody else's. It's to teach you that if this woman were in this in-between stage and never really fully left her father, well, she did leave her father's house, but didn't go into the husband's house yet, where she's in no man's land. In this case, no, right? So now she becomes in woman's land. She's in her own land. So, once she left her father's domain and she was passed on to the messengers of her husband, he can't nullify her vows anymore. So anyway, the whole thing about the father not being able to nullify her vows, once she's married, and of course, once she's, even if she never fully got married, she was on the way to get married, we already learned that from a different pasuk. We don't need the lechem pasuk to teach you that, which goes back and reinstates source number 2 as a proof. Mi lechem and not mi chazev v'shok. And it doesn't come to exclude and not that he can nullify her vows. Next proof, third proof. Rav Safra Omer, mi lechem avia tochal. In a different way he darshans it from here. Mi lechem hakanoi la'avia. I'm sorry, I skipped it. Lechem v'lo basal. Bread, but not meat. Here, lechem, it's the opposite. It's taken super literally. And it's telling you she can eat the bread, she can't eat the meat. Meat, sacrificial meat, chazev v'shok. Rav Papa Omer, also milechem avia tochal, but differently. Focus on whose bread is it? Her father's bread. Lechem hakanoi la'avia. Truma becomes the father's property. Okay? But, prat l'chazev v'shok. Demi shulchan gavoa kazachi. Shulchan gavoa, it was part of the mizbeach. It was part of a sacrifice to God. It's not lechem avia, right? The truma becomes his own. But the chazev v'shok is a gift, but it's a gift from the table of God. That's not lechem avia. So we exclude that. Or, fifth one and last proof, Rav Amar ve'et chazer tnufa ve'et shokat truma tochlu atau v'necho v'notecha itach. Bizman she'itach. Instead of proving it from the pasuk about what you can eat, in the truma case, we're now going to prove it from the pasuk about the chazev v'shok. The chazev v'shok is given to the kohen to eat, you, your sons, your daughters, with you. What does with you mean? With you means they're with you entirely, meaning they weren't married to somebody else in the interim. Okay? Particularly the women. The men, it doesn't matter. They're always with the father, but that's because they, on their own rights, have it anyway. But the daughter, only if she's itcha, which means 100%, which means she wasn't married in the interim. Amar Rav Ada bar Ava, Tana, Keshi chozeret lebeit avia, chozeret letruma ve'ena chozeret lechazev v'shok. Okay, this is a brighter that says what we just said. When the Bat Kohen goes back, and again, we started with the case in our Mishnah, which wasn't the Bat Kohen case. It was a Bat Yisrael who was married to a Kohen and gets to go back after her kids die and all that. She can go back and eat in her first husband's house. But then we shifted to the Bat Kohen because we learned it all from the Bat Kohen case. And now we're going to go back to the comparison of the two. So we just said in this Braita the same thing that we said just before, which is when it comes to the bat kohen going back to her father's house, she eats truma, but she can't eat chazev v'shok. But the Braita continues and says, bishvil b'na, the case in our Mishnah, where she's allowed to go back to the Kohen's house because she was married to him and has a son from him, and whatever son she had from any other marriages is no longer around, and neither are her husbands. Chozeret af lechazev v'shok. She even gets chazev v'shok. To which Rav Mordechai has a very serious question on this. And he says, what are you talking about? Azal Rav Mordechai, Amra lishmate kamei de Rav Ashi. He brought up this halacha in front of Rav Ashi and said to him, what a ridiculous thing, Amar. Mehecha kamit rabya. Where did we learn the whole halacha that the woman is allowed to eat truma and go back to her husband's house? Where did we learn it from? From the bat kohen who gets to come back to her father's house, right? Mi'ubat. Mi'adif ala mina, and now you're going to give her more power than the bat kohen has, right? The whole halacha was learned out from the bat kohen. And now we're going to say, well, if you're the bat kohen who goes back to her father's house, you can't eat the chazev v'shok. But if you're a bat Yisrael who married a kohen and you then married someone else, and now you're going back to eating, then you can eat the chazev v'shok. That whole law was derived from that law. How can we possibly expand it and have it more expansive than the first, than the original? This question is an excellent question. The answer Rav Ashi gives is not as convincing, okay? Or possibly I don't fully understand it. But what he answers is, Hatam k'tiva mi'ute. By the bat kohen, it specifically had all these phrases, we just saw 5 of them, where it excludes them. They're particularly excluded from the verse. Hacha lo k'tiva mi'ute. But by this woman, there's no mi'ut in the pasuk. Now this woman is a little tricky. She's not really written about in the Torah, so that's why it's a little tricky what he's talking about. But maybe it just means a woman who has zchut, a wife of a kohen has zchuyot to eat truma, and there's no limitations. And therefore, it comes from that base halacha, and there's no limitations there, and therefore the limitations are exclusively for the bat kohen. It's a little bit of a tricky answer, because again, this was all derived from those, so if those have mi'utim, these should have also. Anyway, there's a little bit of a debate about it. Bat kohen shenos niset l'Yisrael v'chulei. Starting now, a sugya that's going to go till the end of the chapter. It's quite confusing, I will warn you, okay? But I'm going to try to make it organized enough so it won't be super confusing. V'shava el beit avia. First, we're going to see a drashot, Tanu Rabbanan, a Braita, of things that we've seen already before, which is the bat kohen shava el beit avia. She goes back to her father's house. What are we darshan from those words? She goes back to her father's house. Prat l'shameret yabam. This excludes someone who doesn't go back to her father's house, who's still, okay, our favorite word, zika, who still has zika to her first husband's house, meaning he died without children. She's supposed to do yibum. While she's in this interim stage, she can't go back to her father's house because of the pasuk. It says she goes back to her father's house in the case where she fully goes back to her father's house, and not that she's still got some connection to her husband's family, namely, she's supposed to do yibum. Kine ureha, as we see many times, as she was in her youth, not right now, she's pregnant. If she's pregnant, then she doesn't go back to her father's house and eat. Remember, if she ends up with a child, then basically she's in the husband's realm. If she's married to a Yisrael, she can't go back and eat truma in her father's house as long as that child is alive. V'halo dinhu. Now, they say, wait a minute. This should be a vachomer. What's the vachomer? Before we get to the vachomer, I'm going to bring up the sheet. I don't have it translated into English, but I will explain it all. And there's 3 basic concepts we're going to talk about. Okay, we're going to start with 2 and then get to the 3rd. Anyway, I numbered them to make it easier to refer back to them. The first is asa or lo asa vlad ben harishon kivlad ben hasheni. What's confusing about the daf for the most part is they're going to keep going over these phrases, and it's a little hard from the words to understand what the phrase is talking about. That's why I explain them here, and hopefully we'll remember them as we go through. And we're going to see them many, many times, so hopefully by the end you'll get it clear. This means a woman's married to 2 husbands. Okay, first one, then he dies, and then she marries somebody else. And she has a child from the first, and she has a child from the second. Or maybe she doesn't have a child from the second, we're going to see. But let's assume she has a child from the first. So she's married now. We're going to talk about each of these 3 categories as they relate to yibum and truma. You can already see from the chart that each one is yes for one and no for the other. Okay? And it flips, right? This one is yes for yibum, no for truma. This one is yes for yibum. This one is no for yibum, yes for truma. And the other 2 are yes for yibum, not for truma. Anyway, that's just you'll see in a minute. Lo asav laban harishon kivlaban hasheni means if a woman's married to a second husband and she doesn't have, okay, we're going to talk about in yibum first. She doesn't have a child from the second one, but she has a child from a previous marriage, is she obligated in yibum? The obvious answer is of course. Why? Because yibum goes by the husband, not by the wife. So I could have to do yibum even though I have children, because I had children from a previous marriage. But yibum has to do with this particular husband. And therefore, yibum is going to be even. So now, what are the words? Lo asav lad min rishon. The child from the rishon is not like the child from the second. Meaning, if there's no child from the second, the child from the first is irrelevant to the picture. You have to do yibum. It's actually very simple. It's just a convoluted wording. It sounds very confusing. In truma, what's our whole Mishnah based on? The vlad min harishon is relevant, right? In other words, we don't ignore a child from a previous marriage. Okay? Like, for example, with the bat kohen. If she has a child from one husband, right, it precludes her from eating something, right? It precludes her from going back home, right? So basically, each child is relevant in the picture of truma. You don't ignore children ever, okay? In the case of yibum, we ignore children because we say the wife's obligated in yibum even if she has a child from another marriage. In the case of a woman marrying, if she has children from a different marriage, that could preclude her, or right, from eating truma from another husband. Ubar ki yilod. Okay, the second concept we're going to talk about is, if a woman's pregnant, do we view the fetus as if it was born? Okay, this is again going back to the famous abortion topic. So, in yibum, yes, in truma, lo. What does this mean? If a husband dies without kids, but his wife is pregnant, right, you might say he died without kids. What's the difference? What happens down the road? But no, we don't say that. We care what happens down the road. The fact that she was pregnant at the time means that maybe she'll have a child from him, and therefore she doesn't do yibum, right, unless the child doesn't make it. But if the child makes it, then she does. She doesn't do yibum. So the ubar is like as if the child was already born. But when it comes to truma, we already learned, if she's pregnant, right, number one, she can't go back and eat in her father's house because an ubar is, right, let's talk about it this way. It's the other way. In ubar does not allow you, if you're married to a kohen and he dies and you're pregnant, you can't eat truma. Remember? Okay, that's ubar kilo. Meitim, right? It's not like the child is born, so you can't. It doesn't allow you to feel to be connected to that family. Meitim kechayim. Okay, what is this? Okay, yibum is very simple. If you had a child, we talked about this before. You had a child when the husband dies and there's a child there, but then the child dies and you haven't done yibum yet. But we don't care because meitim are like chayim. The live baby, right? A dead baby in this case is like a live child. It's as if since he died and the child was alive still, even if the child dies, it's, right, you might have thought, oh, it's as if he doesn't have children in the world. No, he had a child when he died, so therefore you're exempt from yibum. But when it comes to our case, what did we say with the truma? Every time the kid dies, right, he's dead. He's out of the picture. He's not treated like a live child. Okay? Those are the three laws you have to know in order to get started. Again, we'll review them as we go through if it was a little confusing. So now they say, why do you need to say, if she's pregnant, she can't go back to eating in her father's house? V'halodinhu. Uma bimkom shelo asav labin harishon, kiv labin hasheni lepotra min yibum. Okay, we're going to basically do a vachomer. If, in case number one, asav labin harishon, kiv labin hasheni, meaning, we don't, right, we lo asa. By yibum, this law is not applicable. If she has a child from her first marriage, she still is obligated in yibum. We ignore that child, right? It doesn't allow her to be exempt from yibum, and yet asa ubar ki yilod. But yet, if she's pregnant, she doesn't do yibum because the ubar is considered as if it's a child. Therefore, so now, if that is no, and yet number two is yes, then if by truma number one is yes, then we would assume by vachomer number two would be yes. So, makom she'asav lamin harishon kiv lamin hasheni leposla min truma. In a case of truma, where we do count a previous child can disqualify her from eating truma, and a bat kohen can't go back as long as she still has children from some previous marriage. Eino din shenaseh ubar ki yilod. Wouldn't we then say that in this halacha of number two, the ubar would be as if it was born? So they say, right, and therefore, it would be an obvious halacha, the prat lemu'uberet. If she's pregnant, she doesn't get to go back to her father's house. To which they say, it would be obvious from a vachomer, why do you need a pasuk to teach it? So the answer is no, lo mali. And then now they say, wait, there's another issue though. Mali asa ubar ki yelod le'inyan yibum. In other words, why? We were trying to say, look, number one by yibum is no. Like if you just look at it simply, the way they're doing it like this is, number one by yibum is low, meaning the child from the first marriage is irrelevant. And yet ubar ki yelod. And that's why if truma is yes to answer question number one, then it should be also yes to, right? We should do ubar ki yelod in the second category. So now they say, in the end they say, one second. Okay, so now they say, no. Na'aseh ubar ki yelod le'inyan truma shelo look, because Mali asa ubar ki yelod le'inyan yibum. What's the reason why ubar is ki yelod? Not because, lo asa there and yes asa here. But it's because shara asa meitim kechayim. Yibum has a special, unique chumrah that meitim are like chayim. And therefore, na'aseh ubar ki yelod le'inyan truma shelo asa meitim kechayim. You want to make ubar ki yelod le'inyan truma lo asa meitim kechayim. In other words, the reason in yibum that it's yes is because it's yes in answer number 3. But for truma, it's no, and therefore for ubar ki yelod, it should also be no. Talmud lomar, that's why you need kinu'urea prat le'me'uberet. Actually, I just realized that I wrote something wrong on this chart entirely. In ubar ki yelod, we're suggesting that maybe it's no, but in the end, it actually is yes. But why is it yes? It's yes because of the pasuk. Okay? In the end, it's because we have a pasuk of kinu'urea prat le'me'uberet, that she is, the ubar is like a yelod, okay? And she can't go back to eating truma. That's why I was getting confused before. It's, ubar is ki yelod. The question is, we would have thought from a vachomer that it's not. Comes in the end, they say, no, we could have thought from your vachomer could go either direction. Therefore, put the vachomers out of the picture. And in the end, we can say it's because of a pasuk. That's why we needed the pasuk. That whole point was basically to say, why do we need the verse prat le'me'uberet? That's the reason, right? Kinu'urea prat le'me'uberet. You couldn't have learned it from a vachomer because we have two different things that are different, an opposite halacha. You could have said the vachomer in different directions, and therefore we ignore it. Now we say the following. First of all, why do we need a pasuk v'zera ein la, and why do we need a pasuk of a me'uberet? Theoretically, a me'uberet also kind of has zera, right? She has some child. So why do we need both by truma? So they say, right, two reasons, right? She can't go back if she has children, and she can't go back if she's pregnant. Why do you need two separate psukim for this? Itzrich l'michtav zera ein la, itzrich l'michtav me'uberet, and itzrich kinu'urea, and itzrich l'michtav v'zera ein la. Why do you need them both? You would have said mi'ikar chagufa v'hashta trei gufe. In the beginning, this is a fascinating thing, especially as a woman. Just be prepared, okay? You might have come to this, I would say, a little bit of a ridiculous thinking, which is what? If you only had zera ein la, don't go back if you have children, what would you have thought? Well, I left as one person, and now I'm two people, and that's why I can't go back to my father's house. But you might have thought, if I'm pregnant, if I'm me'uberet, to mikara chagufa, v'hashta chagufa, you're still considered one person. And even though, right, sometimes when you're pregnant, you eat for two. But you're basically one person, you might have thought you could go back. And that's why they tell you, no, not me'uberet. And matecha, you might have thought you could go back, sricha. That's why you need the me'uberet. Okay, the next one is a little bit stranger. What if we just have pregnant? You might have thought, to mikara gufa sricha, turning out I'm a bet. In the beginning, you were with an empty body, and hashta gufa malya, and now you're coming back with a full body. You're not the same person, right? Your hormones are off. You have something else inside you. You're not the same, so you can't go back because you're not the same. But if you go back of zera ein la, but what if you have children? Maybe you would think you can go back with children. Why? Because it's all about you. Your child's just an appendage, let's say. Okay, so to me, kara gufa srika, v'hashta gufa srika. You left, you were empty, meaning you weren't pregnant. You came back, you're empty, you're not pregnant. Maybe you could go back and eat there. And who cares that you have a child, okay? Meaning, right, you could leave your child there and come back and eat in your father's house. So, emalo sricha. That's why you need both psukim. Okay, now, here comes the complicated part of the daf, okay? If we had these vachomers before that we tried to kind of say, we could do a vachomer this way, we could do a vachomer that way. Now what the Gemara is going to do is going to focus on these number 1 and number 3 on the chart. The two issues, okay, we're ignoring right now ubar ki yelod, and we're going to focus on Asa or lo asav laman harishon kivlaman hashini and metim kechayim. And what they really want to get at is this chart at the bottom, which is from what verse do we learn these 4 laws? Okay, in yibum, lo asav laman harishon kivlaman hashini, which again means you can't count a child from a different marriage to exempt a woman from yibum. It only goes by the father. Number 2, by truma, you can count a previous child. We don't ignore previous children. They're very relevant for either not allowing you to go back to your father's house or allowing you to go back to a Kohen's house or all those things. Once you married someone else, we don't ignore previous children. Okay, whereas by yibum, we totally do. Metim kechayim is the opposite, where by yibum, we consider a dead child as if he was alive, meaning if he was alive at the time of the husband's death, and then dies later, we don't say, oh, now you're exempt from yibum. And when it comes to truma, though, a dead child is irrelevant. Once the child dies, you can now either go back to your father's house because you have no children anymore from any other husbands, or the reverse, okay? So dead, right, metim are not considered like chayim. It changes the situation as soon as the child dies. Now, what we're going to basically end up concluding is each one is learned out from a verse, but the way we're going to get there is by saying, if we tried to do we could have done a vachomer. If it weren't for the verse, we would have derived, okay, they're basically, what they're going to do is, in order, right, they're going to basically try to learn number 3 from number 1, vachomer, number 3 from number 3 by yibum, vachomer from yibum and truma of number 1, and number 3 of truma by vachomer of yibum and truma of number 1, and then they're going to flip it and say, maybe we could have learned number 1 from number 3, vachomer, and each time they're going to say, theoretically, you could have had a vachomer to teach you that the law is going to be like yibum or like truma, and in the end we have a verse to say it's not. Okay, that's basically, we're going to have 4 suggestions of vachomers here. So starting with the first one, I'm going to skip the simanim. These are just simanim to remember what we're doing, but I'm going to skip that. Amalei Rav Yehuda midiskarta leRav. Lo na'asem metim kechayim li'inyan yibum vachomer. So we're starting with number 3, metim kechayim, and the fact that we say that by yibum, okay, I highlighted it here on the sheet. By yibum, we're in the bottom line of the chart. Metim kechayim kain by yibum. Yes, it's true. Metim are like chayim. Why don't we say they're not from a vachomer? We could have said, Uma b'makom she'asav lamen harishon kivlamen hasheni lepos lamen truma. When it comes to truma, we say, Asav lamen harishon kivlamen hasheni. The answer is yes. And yet, when it comes to metim kechayim, the answer is no. Okay? Lo asav metim kechayim. So therefore, here comes the vachomer. Makom shelo asav lamen harishon kivlamen hasheni lepos lamen yibum. If number 1 is if by truma, number 1 is true, and number 3 is not true. So, if by yibum, number 1 is not true, of course, then 3 will be not the case. Okay, you follow? That's the logic of the vachomer. Ein odin shelo na'aseh metim kechayim, right? So, of course, then we shouldn't do metim kechayim. So they say, right? Shouldn't we say that? So therefore, I'm just going to read it again. So, makom shelo asav lamen harishon kivlamen hasheni lepos lamen yibum. When it comes to yibum, if number 1 is not true, that metim we ignore the first children. Then obviously we should ignore, right, a child who's dead. Lo na'aseh metim kechayim. That's the vachomer. Talmud lomar. Therefore, we have a pasuk to teach it. What's the pasuk? The Torah's ways are pleasant. They're not meant to ruin people's lives. Now think about it, okay? Maybe we should use this keep this in your mind for the next case where we are going to ruin someone's life when we get to the next Mishnah. But right now, we're basically saying the Torah's ways are noam, are pleasant, meaning that if we said a dead could be, if a child dies, all of a sudden you're now going to be obligating yibum. Imagine this poor woman. Her husband dies, she has a child, she thinks she's not obligating yibum. She goes and marries someone, and then it turns out we tell her, oh, by the way, your son now died. Well, you have to do yibum for your first husband, and now you're married, you're stuck. Or even if she wasn't yet married, but she's already dating someone, and then all of a sudden we say you have to do yibum with your brother-in-law, it would mess up her life. So we don't do that. Next. Okay, now we're going to look to what about by truma? Okay, again, each one supposes we know some other halacha, right? And then we kind of raise that in the air. Maybe that's not the case. So when it comes to truma, maybe we should make metim kechayim. We should say dead children are relevant as well. You can't ever go back to eating truma at your father's house because you had a child from your other husband. So what's the vachomer? Again, we're now going to do the flip. Ma by yibum in section number 1, bimkom shelo asav lamen arishon kiv lamen hashini lipotram yibum, and yet even though that halacha is not true, meitim are kechayim. So obviously in a makom she'asav lamen arishon kiv lamen hashini, when the first son is still relevant in the picture by truma, lepos lamen truma, to disqualify her from eating truma, eino din shenaseh meitim kechayim, wouldn't we make also dead children like live children and be stringent? So, Talmud Lomar, that's why we have a special pasuk that says, V'zera ein la. No, because it all depends on, do you have children or do you not have children? And right now, ha ein la. Child's dead, there is no zera, and therefore, we learn from that verse, it's not the case. Next option. Now we're going to do the exact flip. We're not going to look at number 3, we're going to look at number 1. Maybe we should exempt the woman from yibum if she has a child from a previous marriage. Right, again, which would be ridiculous from all we know of yibum. But again, this is a purely theoretical discussion. If by truma at the bottom here, dead or not, like alive, and yet asav laben arishon kiv laben hasheni, and yet when it comes to this halacha of the first child, we are considering him relevant. So makom she'asa meitim kechayim, if yibum is more strict, because meitim are like chayim, then linyan yibum eino din shenasev lamen arishon kiv lamen hasheni. We should be strict with this law as well, or not strict, but take it seriously, right? And make the vlad rishon kiv lamen hasheni. Talmud Lomar, that's why it says ubein ein lo. The pasuk teaches you, no, he doesn't have a son. Ha ein lo. It's all about the husband. It has nothing to do with the woman. It's all about the man. He has no children, and therefore yibum is necessary. Last option here, v'lo na'aseh, last suggestion, lo na'aseh v'laben arishon kiv lamen hasheni l'truma mikal vachomer. Don't make, right now we're moving on to truma of case number 1. Maybe we shouldn't have the first child count. Why? Ma makom mikal vachomer. Ma b'makom she'asa meitim kechayim lepotram min yibum. If by yibum meitim are kechayim, and yet lo asav lamen arishon kiv lamen hasheni, but yet we're lenient about this one, or we ignore that child. Makom shelo asa meitim kechayim. If we don't make dead children like live children lenient truma, eino din shelo nasev lamen arishon kiv lamen hasheni. Right? If 3 is no, then right. If by, again, this is a very simple way of saying it. If by yibum 3 is yes and 1 is no, then by truma, if 3 is no, then 1 should be no as well. Again, Talmud Lomar ein la v'ha yesh la. This is learned from the same pasuk, because it says zera ein la. In this case, she actually has children. It's all about her as opposed to him, and therefore she is going to be obligated, right? It is going to be considered her child for truma, which will disqualify her from eating truma. And with that, hadron alach yesh mutarot. Again, purely theoretical discussion. Really, in very simple terms, and that's why I put the second chart on the sheet. It's just trying to tell you from what verse do we learn it. And why do we need a verse and we couldn't have just learned it from a vachomer? Okay. Now moving on to a super central sugya in Yevamot and in Gemara in general, which is number 1, testimony. What kind of testimony is accepted? We know by Torah law 2 witnesses. Okay, we're now going to have a woman whose husband goes abroad. She thinks he's dead. Okay, unfortunately, it's still a relevant case in our day where happens, right? 9/11 was a big situation, right? You didn't know were people alive or not. All sorts of situations like this happen where all of a sudden you just don't know if someone died or not. On what testimony can you write? The rabbis are going to say you can accept 1 witness. Okay? Now, huge debate about this, and you should definitely listen to Gefet this week. It went up already. All about akirat davar min Torah. Can you really uproot something from the Torah? A fascinating topic, particularly for Shavuot. We're learning about the importance of the acceptance of the Torah, and yet we're going to see for the next number of dapim these issues and struggles with how much power do the rabbis have to override things in the Torah. Do they have the power? Do they not? What in Gefet, she talks about different approaches of the Rishonim to understanding this. Is it really Torah? Is it D'Rabbanan? And that's why they can override it, but it's not really Torah law, and they really can't override Torah law. And it gets to a huge discussion about what power the rabbis have. So with that, we will get started, and we'll pull up a chart, even though it's not as critical today, but okay, this is just the Mishnah, which we did yesterday, so I put it in today's chart as well, but here we go. Hayisha shalach ba'ala l'medinat hayam. Her husband goes abroad. Okay, first they were married. Okay, now he goes abroad. Ba'u va'amrula. Now pay attention to the wording. It says, and they came and said to her. Okay, but the Gemara is going to obviously assume it means only one witness said to her. Even though it says plural, it's a bit of a struggle in the Mishnah, but they're going to say it's really only one person. Okay, and they said, Meit ba'alech. They said your husband died. Okay, this is the sign for thinking the husband died. Vinisate, and then she gets married. Okay, she marries someone else thinking her husband's dead. So she marries, Yael marries Moshe. She was married to Reuven first, now she marries Moshe. V'achar kach ba ba'ala, all of a sudden her husband appears on the scene. Tetzei mizeh u'mizeh, she has to get divorced from both of them. And tzricha get, in other words, tetzei meaning she has to leave both husbands. She can't be married to either one of them. U'tzricha get mizeh u'mizeh. She needs a get from each of them. Okay, now, let's stop for a minute. Now, this is a very difficult situation. On the one hand, we're being lenient on this woman and we're letting her rely on one witness to go get married. It's okay she got married. However, if her husband comes back on the scene, we're going to penalize her and majorly penalize her. Okay? So we end up with this. On the one hand, we want to help this woman. On the other hand, we're going to majorly penalize her. I'm going to leave you in suspense as to why exactly we penalize her. Okay? The Gemara is going to get into it and give us some explanations as to why we're penalizing her, but get ready for penalty upon penalty upon penalty. Number one, you can't stay married to your first husband or the second. Now you have to think about it. I see you're asking about Ha'isha Rabbah. I didn't talk about that. It's called Ha'isha Rabbah because there's a bunch of prakim called Ha'isha, and because this is a long parak and also a very central parak, so they call it Ha'isha Rabbah. Okay, so now, she now has to get divorced from both. Now, theoretically, and this is where the Torah law comes in. By Torah law, she's still married to the first husband. If she's married to the first husband, what did we learn? If she marries someone else, Ein Kiddushin Tovsim. She's actually not even married to the second husband. Yet, we're going to require him to give her a get. We're going to get into all this later. Why? She's really not married to him. And why can't she just go back to her original husband? So, again, this is a penalty. So here goes. She needs a get from each. Ein la lo k'tuba. She doesn't get k'tuba. Lo peiro, lo mazono, lo blaot. All those things we've seen before. Lo al zeh v'lo al zeh. Not for either husband. Im natla mizeh u'mizeh. What if she took it anyway? Tachzil. She has to return it. And they can demand it in court. Havlab mamzeh u'mizeh u'mizeh. If she remains married to the second husband, she has to, the child's a mamzer. The child from the second husband for sure is a mamzer. Even the child from the first husband, theoretically by Torah law, she's married to him. She remains married to him after this is found out and has a child. Child's a mamzer. If they're both kohanim, nobody becomes impure to her because she's not their wife. Even though she is, she's considered not their wife because they're supposed to divorce her. He doesn't get the rights that are given to him in the ketubah, like he can get her mitzia. He can get, this isn't the ketubah, this is a different law, but anything she finds goes to him, not in this case, because they're not really married. He doesn't get her income, and lo ba'afarat nedareh, he doesn't get to annul her vows. Hayta bat Yisrael nifselet min ha'kehuna. If she was a bat Yisrael, she can no longer eat. She's disqualified from kahuna. She can't marry a kohen, because she's called a zona. She can't eat truma. Ubat Levi min ha'ma'asel. Abat Levi becomes disqualified from eating ma'asel. Abat kohen min ha'truma. Okay, so if she's bat Yisrael, she can't marry a kohen. If she's a bat Levi, she can't eat maaser, and a bat kohen can't eat truma, and obviously they also can't marry a kohen. Ve'en yorshim shel zeh v'yorshim shel zeh et ktubata. The yorshim of either husband don't inherit any part of her ketubah. That's all halacha we'll get into later. Im metu. That's the next part in the presentation. If they died, okay, let's say both husbands died, and they each have brothers. So achiv shel zeh v'achiv shel zeh chotzim v'lo miyabmin. Each of the brothers can only do chalitza and not yibum because, again, she's sort of married to them, but not really married to them. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Now we're going to have some other less strict opinions here. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Ktubatan l'chsei ba'ala harishon. She gets her ketubah from her first husband. Rabbi Elazar Omer. Harishon zakai b'mitziyatav ma'aseh yadeh u'farat nedareh. He looks at the husband's perspective and says, well, the husband gets those things. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Bi'atah u'chalitzata me'achiv shel rishon poteret sarata. If the first husband dies without children and she does yibum, it exempts the second wife he might have. Even though, right, the Tanna Kama said no yibum at all. Well, he thinks yes, and ein avla mimenu mamzer. And the child would not be considered a mamzer because really the first marriage is actually valid, the second one is not. V'im niseit shelo b'reshut. Now we get to case number 2. So that was a whole bunch of opinions about case number 1. What if she gets married shelo b'reshut? We're going to have to understand what that means. Muteret lachzor lo. She can go back to him. We're going to see, the Gemara is going to immediately say, that means the Beit Din can give her a reshut, but there were two witnesses. She didn't need a reshut from the court because there were two witnesses that said he was dead. As opposed to the first case, which was one witness, but with a court. That's the first thing the Gemara is going to say. Niseit al pi Beit Din, titzei p'tuah min hakorban. If the Beit Din, with witnesses, said he's definitely dead, then if it turns out he was alive, she has to get divorced from him anyway, but she doesn't have to bring a sacrifice, like a korban chatat, a sin offering for having slept with someone by accident that she wasn't allowed to sleep with. Lo niseit al pi Beit Din, teitzei v'chayevet b'korban. If it wasn't that the Beit Din decided it, then she actually has to bring a sacrifice. Yafeh koch Beit Din, here you see, starting to talk about the importance of the Beit Din, sheputra min hakorban. If she did it by Beit Din, that makes it better for her. Okay? It gives her more, that she doesn't have to bring this korban. Here's a great line, and here maybe you start to get an inkling as to why they're penalizing this woman. They're a little bit worried about her. They said, if the Beit Din said she could get married, and then she goes and just sleeps around with lots of different men, and it turns out she was an eshet ish, well then, chayevet b'korban. We're going to make her bring a korban. Why? The rabbis are being lenient with her to remarry, not to go sleep around with anybody she wants. Okay? So, tough. That's the Mishnah. We're going to deal with this Mishnah for a while now. So the Gemara says, "Mitaktani seif and say shelo b'reshut muteret lachzor lo, shelo b'reshut Beit Din ela be'edim, michlal dereisha b'reshut Beit Din u'be'ed echad." When it says lo b'reshut Beit Din, it must be there were witnesses, but not court. Otherwise, why would she be allowed to go back to her first husband? Must be because she relied on witnesses. So now, right in that case, again, it says she can stay married to her first husband because she went by witnesses. So now they say, it sounds like then the first part must be b'reshut Beit Din with only one witness. Okay, even though it said amrula, they assume it must be. Al me'ed echad ne'eman. This is the big sugya. One witness is clearly trusted. Utna nami huchziku liot b'siyin al pi ed mipi ed, isha mipi isha, isha mipi eved, mipi shivcha, al me'ed echad ne'eman. And we'll stop here for today. This is a really big line. This basically says the rabbis clearly allowed her to marry based on one witness, based on hearsay testimony, based on testimony of a woman from a woman, based on testimony from a woman from a slave or a maidservant. We're super, super, super lenient here about what witnesses we will accept. Again, remembering though, eventually we might penalize you though if they were wrong. Okay, so we're in this, a lot of confusion at this point. We'll get into the sugya a lot more in depth, a fascinating sugya. And with that, we'll end today's class. Have a great day.